Well, that's a very interesting question. Well, I equate architecture and music. And music is volume and architecture is space. And in ancient times, musical scales were incorporated very often into the geometry of buildings. Now, that's that. So, and music has always been an important part of my life. And what I love about music, particularly Bach, is that he takes a theme and plays on that theme. And for me, that's what I do in architecture. It's a question of finding a theme, usually dictated by the site. You have to know the site extremely well, every little nuance. And in a sense, your mind browses the site to try and pick up every little detail. And then architecture for me is also a three-dimensional process. It's not a question of making a plan and projecting elevations. The mind, when it absorbs all of the information required, there's an intuitive emergence of an idea which is basically fully three-dimensional. And I think on that particular project, well, like music, different people like different kinds of music. Intuitively, and what it is, I think, that they find or they love about the music that they like is it strikes a chord with them. And I think architecture's the same. I think if there's any enduring interest in a house or a piece of architecture, it's that it has struck a chord with the observer. And I think that's what's happened in this case. Once again, it's the site. When Audette took me to the site, in those days it was very pristine. There were very few houses. And it must have looked exactly like Walter Burley Griffin found it. It was a beautiful site. It had a lovely aspect, northern aspect. And I spent a lot of time on that site, learning and discovering its little secrets in a way. So there was absolutely no way you could put an American Cape Cod house on that site. I mean, it's just a ridiculous concept. And I was living in a one-bedroom, not apartment, one-bedroom space in King's Cross. So I built a model. You know, I had a vision of this house and I built a model. Now, where that inspiration came from, I'm not sure. I mean, where does one pick up themes? I'd only really just recently been introduced to Frank Lloyd Wright's work, for example, and a friend of mine lent me a whole set of magazine pages that he'd ripped out, and I'd had a look through them. And of course, it struck an accord with me. I liked his architecture, but didn't mean to say that I attempted to copy his architecture, but I think it might have had an influence on me in this particular occasion, because the theme that came up is what you see. And I built the model in my little bedroom as I imagined it, and I erected it at a high level. And when they came to visit to have a look at my designs, I left the plans on the bed and the model at eye level, and I said, "Excuse me, I have to go out for 10 minutes." And I left them with it. I didn't hard sell it at all. And when I came back, they said, "Yes, we'll build it, but we'll take it to CSIRO to put it under the planetarium to have a look at how the sunlight penetrates in different times of the year. Well, I had used a sun protractor to ensure that that was well cared for. And so that's how it eventuated. And that photograph of that model is identical in a sense to the house that it was built. Almost. The detail of the brickwork is another issue. But anyway, so that's how it eventuated, and that's how they accepted it. Well, I knew very little about architects, even after I graduated with my Master of Architecture degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and I came to Europe. And I'd heard that there was a Le Corbusier building in Paris. And I did some travelling around Europe, and I decided to have a look at this building in Paris, and I was absolutely disgusted. I mean, I think everybody else in Paris was disgusted also, because it was like an abandoned building, very bad in detail, and in my opinion, very ugly. And so from that moment on, I lost all interest in anything further to do with Le Corbusier. And when I was more or less introduced to Frank Lloyd Wright, when I got back to Australia by this friend of mine, it struck a chord with me. It's as simple as that, you know. It's the way you're wired, I think. It's intuitive. Well, the thing is that as a young man, my father was 6 years away at the war. And he left when I was 12, and I didn't see him till he came back when I was 18. So every year in the school holidays, from the age of 12, I'd go up to Renmarkenberry and pick fruit for 3 months and make £90, which saw me through the whole of the next year of schooling and everything. It gave me a terrific sense of independence, and at the same time, a fantastic appreciation of the Australian bush. I mean, after picking fruit, I'd go swimming in the River Murray and in the natural landscape, untouched natural landscape. But also our family house in Adelaide was on the edge of Adelaide, up in the foothills. And I could walk out of there and walk through the foothills into the hills, explore the mining caves and things like that. So I was very attuned to that part of nature and my life. And it was just natural that I'd veer towards architecture that respected that kind of atmosphere. Now, remember, this is my first building, my first design, and there was a lot of interest in it, I must say, but there were a lot of comments like it's an immature work. Now, I regard that as a bit unfair, I must admit. Being my first work, I guess it had to be a bit immature, but it was a very solid foundation for me. It was the beginning, if you like, and it gave me an enormous amount of self-confidence in doing that. I found it difficult to resolve the issues of the balancing the service section of the house, which was solid, with the living section of the house, which was airy and light. And to join those two elements together was, in a sense, intuitive. It may, if I look at it very closely, I may see an element of Frank Lloyd Wright's desert house in there. So that may have emerged from those early photographs I saw. But I think it was resolved in the end okay. And the fact was that the model was built right at the beginning, and the actual house that was eventually built was almost exactly the same as the model, except for some of the building materials used. That's it. Well, he didn't. The condition of my employment as architect was to provide the documentation and the design, not to supervise. But he allowed me 5 supervision visits at 10 shillings a visit. Now, I think an architect's salary in those days was about £20 a week. So 10 shillings represented 1 hour of work. And I arrived one day and found this whole stack of red bricks. And awful, I mean, I hated them. But he had bought them cheaply, and he decided to build them into the house. Naturally, I tried to make them, to soften them in some way. And I devised the idea of when the bricklayer laid the bricks, he was to squash the mortar out and not wipe it clean. And that became known as snotted brickwork. Anyway, it did soften the texture of the walls. But it was a different house. It would have been a completely different house if it had been built in Sydney sandstone. And that was my disappointment, but that was a big lesson for me. So I never ever accepted a project unless I had full supervision. And in fact, one of my projects, just to mention, was I started getting work for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and I did a design for a building, I think in Tamworth. Anyway, and it was built. And one of my concepts was to have a wall mural facing the street behind some brick columns. The chairman of the bank had an artist friend, and he wanted this artist friend to do the mural. And it was a kind of a fake kind of Aboriginal drawing. It was okay. But the chairman decided to demolish my columns and put pipe columns in so that you could see better the mural. I wrote him a letter and I said, this is not acceptable. I want the columns put back. The columns were put back. I was already working on a project for another one of the banks, branch banks, which was taken away from me, and that was the end of my work for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Now, the Audette House actually, if people were to look at my website, petermuller.org, you'll see early photographs of that house, and you'll see what I mean by playing on a theme, because playing on a theme involves some gross forms and some very delicate forms. And that house had a lot of really delicate playing on the theme. To look at the house, you'll learn to understand what the themes are. But now, today, with the refurbishment of the house by different owners, those delicate themes have gone, unfortunately. But the gross form of the house is basically still there, yes. Well, in the 50s, most houses had entrance halls, and you moved from there into the living rooms and dining rooms and so on. In this house, it was just you walked straight into the house. There was no hall, there was a little light staircase in front of you that took you upstairs. You turned right into the solid area of the kitchen and so on. And you entered straight into a room which was light and airy and became part of the view and the landscape. The house I would have liked to have pushed further forward towards the water so that you could have seen more of the water, but there was a restriction placed on that property and all the properties along there for a future highway to be built. Of course it never will be built and never was built, but that was one of the problems for me, was that I had to keep the house pulled back. Yes, well, Audette House, of course, the block of land wasn't as complicated as the block of land in Palm Beach. Now, the block of land in Palm Beach was extraordinary because it was west-facing. It was against a council parkland. So there's nothing in front but a natural reserve. And it had a cliff and a huge natural boulder and magnificent Angofra gum trees. And it was a strange shaped site. It was triangular. And it took a lot of sitting on and moving through and discovering its secrets. And to thread a house into that particular environment took quite a lot of meditation and thought. I didn't have a client problem because that was me. Yes, and so that idea emerged suddenly after a lot of time spent on trying to understand the problems of the site. I just wanted to design buildings appropriate and give integrity to the site. They were always site specific. In fact, in my website I've written an article on my attitude to what being site specific means. And that's a rather complicated bit of a story, but it's what I'm all about actually in the end. It's like a composer. You compose a symphony and then you move on to the next one. I mean, that's done, that's fixed. Unfortunately, with architecture, it's not always fixed. People move in and make changes. And the only thing about the Audette House that I regret is it's lost a lot of its subtlety. But it's still there, and I know that people like it. I mean, Carol thinks it's the best house I ever did. When she went through it, even after all the alterations, she said, "Oh, I want to live here." So it struck a chord with her.